Sometimes things happen that we can't quite put our finger on. We don't really know why they happened or how they happened. It's sort of outside of the realm of, our understanding. And, it's hard for us to compartmentalize what transpired, but, we always find a way. And, if you try hard enough, there's an old saying that goes, if you can't explain something, don't try, because you're gonna end up hurting yourself thinking too hard about that one. And you don't want to do that, because that's gonna mess you up in the long run. So if you could just reach into your pocket for me and oh, what's that in your hand? What you got there in your hand? You just pull out your pocket. What's that? Oh, that's 2 tickets. 2 tickets to the Bonkers Theater. Albert Small was your average fella you would find in the small town of Ruffington, Nebraska. His son was star quarterback at the local high school. He would come out every Friday to cheer his son on and watch his team play. The team, of course, was known as the Golden Retrievers, a fitting mascot to the upbeat and cheerful students there at the high school. They would win very often. They're very good at what they did. His son, especially, his name was Jeffrey Small. He did such a good job. He would always throw the ball real good, and he'd also catch the ball real good, and he'd be able to run with the ball, and he'd be able to do a little maneuver where he would get around another player. No matter how big the player was, he was able to get around him somehow. Even though he was a pretty big guy himself, he was flexible and versatile in that way. He was able to sort of move in between their arms. They would throw punches at him occasionally, which wasn't really allowed, but it was high school. Nobody really cared. They just wanted to see their kids play ball, and that's what they would do. Also, the coach didn't really intervene much. He was honestly just an average drunk. Didn't really pay much attention. He was often off to, talking to some of the mothers who came out to support their kids. Honestly, not a great guy, that guy. But anyway, Jeffrey was one of the greatest ball players that the Golden Retrievers had ever seen. He would run up and down the field, scoring all the touchdowns, and sometimes they'd even let him kick the field goals, even though that's not really his job, but they'd give it to him sometimes, and he would do that for sure. And then one night, he won this great game, and everybody rose their feet and started cheering for him, and he was really happy about that. And they all ran out to the field. He won in the last minute. He made a really good touchdown, and the referee gave him like 1,000 points. And everybody ran out, and they started, throwing him up in the air and cheering him on. And it was really just a great time, and you really had to be there to really see what kind of, event this was. And, Albert's wife, of course, Jeffrey's mother, Susan was her name. She would also cheer him on. She'd say, "Go, Jeffrey, go." She would say that from the sideline. She'd say, "Go, Jeffrey, go." And he went. And that night, he scored really, really big, and everybody was, it was a Jeffrey kind of day, Jeffrey kind of night. And everybody sort of celebrated him on that day, and kind of went down in history as the big game that he had won. But none of that really has to do with anything. It was just, he played a really good game that day, and they all went home and celebrated and had a nice night, and they all went to bed that night, and Jeffrey got on his knees and said a silent prayer like dreamers do before resting his head. And Albert, of course, put on his nightcap and blew out his candle, and also tucked himself into bed next to his wife Susan, and he said good night, and started drifting off to sleep. But that was until he heard an awful noise coming from outside the window across the other house. The house that was next to them, the neighbor's house. Albert was shocked by this. He's like, the neighbor's house? We don't even have any neighbors. That house has been for sale for years. Much to his surprise, he, rose to his feet and looked out the window. And across from him, inside, he could see on the upstairs window of the other house. He looked up in there. There was a light on, and there was people moving around. He could see the shadows casting around. There was somebody moving up in the window, and he's like, we must have got neighbors. And the barking and howling was going on. He's like, we must have got neighbors, and it sounds like they got a dog in there. Sounds like they got a couple of big dogs in there. And he was like, well, I think I can just ignore that and go back to bed. Albert really didn't like the sound of dogs, so he was very upset that the neighbors had dogs. But, instead he decided, I'm just going to go back to bed and just ignore the dogs. But as he laid down and tried to go back to sleep, the barking and howling just kept going and kept going and kept going. And he's like, I can't deal with this. But he was way too tired to get up and do anything about it, so he just took his other pillow, he took it out from under Susan's head and put it on top of his head to cover his ears from all the barking. And he eventually just fell out of sleep from exhaustion. It wasn't even that it muffled the noise enough. It was just exhaustion of staying up all night. So in the morning he awoke. Him and Susan went to the kitchen and they started making breakfast. Well, he made Susan make the breakfast. She was making big pancakes and sausage and bacon and some scrambled eggs. That's how Albert always liked them. He always liked them scrambled. He's a big scrambled egg fan. And so their son, Jeffrey, he comes downstairs. He says, Dad, did you hear that barking that was going on all night? Did you hear that? Did you hear the barking and the howling? I think, if you ask me, I think we might have a neighbor, and I think they might have some dogs. Yes. And Albert was saying, yes, son, I believe we do have some neighbors, and I think I need to go over there and talk to them about the noise that all their dogs are making, because I didn't get a lick of sleep last night, and I think I'm going to give them a piece of my mind. And Susan was like, oh no, she knows how Albert gets. Albert, he's got a temper on him. He's got a hair trigger, and something can set him off pretty easily. And she says, oh honey, I don't think that's the best idea, really. We should just enjoy breakfast. And Albert looks at her, he says, don't you honey me. I'm going to go over there and I'm going to tell them that they're being, rude, unnice, unkind, unneighborly neighbors. They're not the kind of neighbors I would want to be next to. And I don't think they would appreciate it if we had really loud dogs too. And so he grabbed the baseball bat and he went out the front door with a slam, and he sort of started stumbling. He was foaming at the mouth. He was going straight over to the neighbor's house. And when he arrived there, he started, just banging on the door with his bat, trying to get their attention. And, he started yelling. He's like, hey, it's your neighbor. It's your neighbor that you kept up all night. I'm here. And, the door swung open, and Albert changed his demeanor almost instantly, because he was looking at this really, really tall man whose head was past the door frame. This man was blocky and bulky, and his skin had a sort of blue tint to it. And Albert was terrified. Albert kind of changed his tone when he saw this man, and the man sort of ducked down underneath the door frame, lifting his head underneath it so he could lock eyes with Albert. And Albert said, he was like, "Oh, I'm, your neighbor." He said he couldn't really find his words, but he was pointing over at his house, and the big man, he looked over at where Albert was pointing and saw the house that he was pointing at, and he looked back at Albert and he goes, "House, neighbor." And Albert's like, "That's right, I'm your neighbor. You moved in next to me," Albert said. And they just kind of stared there for a second. It was a very awkward exchange, because clearly the big man did not understand what Albert was saying. He guessed he was sort of introducing himself. But then Albert continued. He said, "Oh, but your dogs were making a lot of noise, and I just wanted to make sure they're not, it's just a suggestion. Maybe your dogs don't make so much noise after 10 p.m." And the big man just stared back at him, and Albert said, 11 p.m.? And, the big man just kept staring, and Albert said, 12? And, the big man finally responded, he said, he wasn't very good with words, but he said, "Dog no make noise." And Albert's like, "Well, that settles that then, neighbor." And he put out his hand to shake it, and the big man just stared back at him, not really knowing what to do. And Albert just kind of retracted his hand and wiped his hand off, and he was like, "Well, I'll see you. I'll see you around." And he just went back to his house. And when he arrived, he slammed the door shut and ran over to the windows and started drawing all the blinds, making sure that nobody could see into the house. And Susan was like, "Honey, what's wrong?" And he's like, "Honey, we have a Frankenstein living next to us. The neighbors are a Frankenstein, and I think they ate the dogs that we heard. I think they were eating them." And Susan was like, "Albert, you're being ridiculous. They are not eating dogs. There is no Frankenstein next door. That's not a real thing." And just then, a knock was heard at their door, except it was a light knock. It was not a Frankenstein knock. So Albert was startled at first, but as he realized the lightness of the knock, he figured, well, it's probably not that big of a deal. It's probably not a Frankenstein. So he went to answer the door, and at the door was this young, lovely lady who was there, and she said, "Hi, neighbor. I just moved in next door, and my husband was saying you came over here and were so nice and greeted him, and we wanted to extend the favor, and I wanted to come over here and greet you." And Albert was shocked. He was thinking in his mind, he was like, this lovely lady right here, this young fine lady is married to that Frankenstein? And he didn't say that, of course. He wouldn't say that to the lady. He wouldn't dare insult her and say her husband looked like a Frankenstein. He would say that to his wife and kid, because he can trust them in their confidentiality to not tell anybody that he's calling people Frankensteins around town. And so Albert, he greeted her, and he was like, "Oh, well, yeah, I went over there and talked to your husband. He's such a strong looking guy." And the woman was like, "Strong looking?" She's like, "Are you sure you met my husband?" And she laughed, and Albert nervously laughed, and he was thinking, like, "Yeah, I met your husband. He was a Frankenstein. If a Frankenstein ain't a strong guy, I don't know what a strong guy is," he was thinking in his head. But then Susan piped in and she was like, "Well, yeah, Albert came over here. He was talking all about your husband and how nice he was, and we'd like to do something together sometime." And Albert looked back, worried. He's like, "Oh, no, don't say that." He's thinking, he was trying to say that in a stare, like, "No, do not invite them over. Her husband's a Frankenstein, and he'll probably eat us," is what was going on in his mind. But Susan didn't really know what to believe, because what she's seeing is a lovely lady, and not the Frankenstein that Albert saw. So she was thinking, well, Albert's probably exaggerating, and maybe her husband's a little, rough around the edges, and maybe he's not actually a Frankenstein. Maybe he's a war veteran or something and got, blown up or something. And maybe he had some, maybe some unsightly war scars, or maybe he used to be a boxer. It could be any explanation, or maybe he was a firefighter who, ran into a burning building to save a bunch of children and ended up having some burn marks or something. So she was rationalizing, there's no way that he saw Frankenstein at that house. So they of course invited her over and said, "You know what, how about you come over for dinner tonight, and we have everybody over." And Albert's like, "Yeah, you can bring those dogs over too." And the lady was like, "Dogs? We don't have any dogs." And Albert's like, "Oh, I could have sworn I heard dogs howling and barking all night." And the woman was like, "No, I don't think we heard any of that. There was no dogs." Albert was kind of perplexed by this situation, and he saw her off, and then when he closed the door behind her, he told his wife and son, he said, I'm being dead serious. Her husband, he's a Frankenstein, and I honestly don't want her over." Susan was like, "You're being prejudiced or something. Her husband can't be a Frankenstein. Nobody like her would marry somebody who's a Frankenstein. That would be absolutely ridiculous." But Albert was fixated on the Frankenstein, and he was like, I gotta get to the bottom of this. So, he got his binoculars and went up to Jeffrey's bedroom, and he looked out the window with his binoculars, and he was sort of looking through the house's window, trying to figure out what was going on in that house across from them. And he was watching for about 20 minutes, and then he saw the lady come out with these large garbage bags that she was kind of dragging across the floor, and she pulled them out to the driveway and opened the trunk of her car and put the garbage bags in the car, and got in the car and drove off. And Albert thought this was strange. He said, maybe that could have been what, that could have been the dogs that they ate. That could have been the bones left over or something. They put those dog bones so nobody would see the dog bones that are garbage. He's going to go dump them in a lake. So Albert ran downstairs and out to the garage and got in his car and started tailing the woman to wherever she was going. And Albert followed her for a while, and he went down the street, and he remembered to, trail from a distance so that she didn't catch on to him behind her. And there was even a point where a car came in between the two, and he let it go in between them so he could have at least one car between them so she wouldn't notice that a man was following her. And eventually the woman pulled off into a nearby grocery store, and he pulled into the parking lot a little bit further away from her and watched her as she walked in. And as she walked in, that's when Albert took his chance, and he ran over to her car and started messing with her trunk. He tried to pop her trunk open, but he couldn't figure out how to do it. And he ran back to his car, and he grabbed his toolbox and got a screwdriver out of it and just started jamming it into the back of the car trunk where there was a spot for the key to go in, and tried to wiggle it loose and get the trunk to pop. But as he was doing that, he kept glancing over to the front of the grocery store, and eventually, after about 10 minutes of sitting in the parking lot trying to get it open, a man came up behind him and said, "What are you doing?" And he's like, "Huh? Oh, what?" He's like, "What? Are you trying to break into that car? Are you trying to?" And he's like, "Oh, no, I'm not trying to break into this car. This is my car, and I accidentally left the keys in the trunk, and I locked myself out. So I'm trying to, wiggle the keys. So I'm trying to put my screwdriver in the key slot and wiggle it loose so that the trunk will pop open. That way I can get my keys, I can get in my car, and I can go home. But, I accidentally, when I was putting my groceries in, and I was shutting the lid, I accidentally dropped my keys into my trunk and slammed it shut. As it was happening all in one motion. Dropped my keys as the trunk was going down, and I was like, slipped my mind, and I accidentally closed my keys into my own trunk. So now I'm here, stuck in the parking lot of this grocery store with my keys in my trunk, with my groceries, which are gonna go bad here soon. Real soon. And, so I gotta get in here and get my keys so I can, go home and my groceries won't be spoiled. I have some milk and some eggs in here that need to stay cold, and it's pretty hot out right now, so, I need to get inside my trunk to get my keys. And the guy was like, "Oh, well, that makes sense," and he, walked off, and Albert let out a sigh of relief. He was like, "Whew, I almost got caught." And then just then he hears, "Albert?" And he turns, and it's the young lady, and she had all of her groceries. She's like, "Albert, what are you doing here outside of my car? That's kind of weird. I just met you, and now you're standing outside of my car. Did you follow me here?" Albert was like, "Well, no, of course not. I didn't follow you here. I'm just going here to get groceries." And he said that as he wiggled the screwdriver back into his pocket. The woman was like, "All right, well, I've got my groceries so I can make a yummy casserole for when for when we have dinner tonight." And Albert was like, "You're right, yeah, I came here to get casserole ingredients too, so we could make you a casserole, and we'll have dinner, just us as neighbors, not just us as in you and me, but us as in your husband and you and me, my wife and my kid, all of us, our two little families are gonna come together and have one we become one big family and have a big dinner to eat together, and we're gonna have 2 casseroles and maybe even a dessert if fate allows." And the woman's like, "Well, that sounds just wonderful. I'm gonna go off and get that right now. You have fun in the grocery store getting whatever you need for that casserole." And Albert's like, "Yep, will do." And so the young lady took off in her car, and Albert was like, "Well, I guess I'll go get some casserole ingredients for tonight. I guess that's the thing to do." And so he went into the grocery store and got all of his casserole ingredients, and he even got a Marie Callender pie for them to thaw out and have for dessert. And he thought that was a pretty good thing to pick up. So he went out and did that, and when he came back home. He gave Susan all the ingredients. And she was like, oh, Albert, we had a bunch of ingredients to make stuff. And she's like, I didn't know you even went out to get that. And he's like, well, I figured I'd go and do that just to, make things easier on you. And, I really like this casserole recipe. I got you the ingredients for a turkey. It's sort of like this like Thanksgiving casserole. It's like turkey and some gravy and some toppings there that will really make it good. She was like, oh, okay, we'll make that, I guess. I was gonna make a sweet potato casserole, but we can make the Thanksgiving casserole. He's like, oh, it's got stuffing on the top. She's like, oh, that's what you mean by the toppings? He's like, yeah, it's stuffing. It's like what you would stuff the turkey with. It's like turkey gravy, and then it's mainly, it's like you have like a crust at the bottom, and then it's almost like a pie, except it's on a sheet. It's like a crust at the bottom. I have the recipe on my phone, but I can send it to you. It's got a crust on the bottom, gravy, turkey, and then on top of it is this dressing, and it gets really crispy when you leave it in the oven, and it gets really good and tasty. And I think you're gonna like it. I think I'm gonna like it because I googled best casseroles, and this was one that came up, was a Thanksgiving casserole. And I think you're gonna like it. I think I'm gonna like it. I think Jeffrey's gonna like it too, because he's a bit of a turkey head. Ain't you, Jeffrey? And Jeffrey's like, yeah, I guess I am a bit of a turkey head, Dad. I guess I am. And he's like, that's right, son. Let's just say Thanksgiving came early in this house. And he's like, oh, I also got a Marie Calendar pie, so we need to let that thaw before the our guests come over. And so the family, they got together, and Jeffrey went off and watched like TV or something, or played video games for a couple hours, and Susan and Albert, they worked in the kitchen making a bountiful feast of a Marie Calendar pie and a turkey Thanksgiving casserole. And then the doorbell rang, and it was the neighbors. They were ready for the neighbors. And Albert was like, oh man, freaking Frankenstein's gonna be behind that door when I open it, ain't he? And when he opened the door, it was just the young lady. And Albert was like, huh? I thought your husband was coming over. Yeah, she was like, oh no, he's not feeling well. He's gonna stay at home today, and I'm just gonna come over, and I brought this yummy sweet potato casserole. And Albert looked over at Susan, and he's like, see, if you would have made that sweet potato casserole, you'd be eating 2 sweet potato casseroles. So it's a good thing that I went out and got the Thanksgiving casserole. Susan's like, yeah, I think you're right. I think that was a good thing. And so the 4 of them sat down and had their Thanksgiving come early feast, and they chowed down on the Marie Calendar pie. And Albert was like, so what does your husband do for work? And the young lady was like, oh well, he and she was stumped. She's like, oh well, he's a house husband, she said. He's like, oh, okay, that makes sense. He's a house husband. So that's why he doesn't get out much, does he? And she's like, no, he mainly stays inside. And Albert was like, oh, interesting. He's like, so what do you do for a living? And the woman was like, oh, well, I do all kinds of stuff. Albert's like, oh, yeah, like what? The lady was sort of nervous and it's like, oh, you know what? It's getting kind of late, and my husband's sick, so I should go check on him. And Albert was like, oh yeah, I guess that sounds like a good idea. Thanks for coming over. And they saw her off. And she went back, and she's like, you know what? I'll take back part of this Marie Callender pie. I'm sure my husband will absolutely adore it. And so she did, and Albert saw her off, and the rest of the family saw her off, and she went back to her house. The door shut, and Albert turned to his family. He said, that lady's husband is a Frankenstein. He said he's a house husband. He never leaves the house, and he's the one time that he's supposed to come outside, he's sick. He's not there. I think what happened is I went over there, and he wasn't supposed to answer the door because he's a Frankenstein, but because he's a Frankenstein, he doesn't think too good. So, I showed up at the door. He heard the loud banging, came down, and he opened the door, saw me there, and she probably was in the house at the time and saw him, that he came to the door, and so she was quiet because she didn't want to blow the cover that he was a Frankenstein and be like freaking out that I'm seeing a Frankenstein in front of me. So she came over and acted as if like her husband's normal, and then now she's like, oh, my husband's sick. And Susan's like, I think you're being a little ridiculous, Albert, that you would think that he's a Frankenstein. He was probably just a big fella, and he was probably just sick, and he probably didn't think so good because he probably had brain fog from whatever sickness he had. He probably had a bad headache. There's probably a lot going on there, and that might have maybe made him look like a Frankenstein. If he was really sick, he probably had bags under his eyes. He was probably pale and clammy. So that's not the best way to judge somebody. It's probably just an unfortunate looking fella, and then he was under even more unfortunate circumstances. And Albert's like, you know what? I don't even want to hear it. I'm going down to the hangout with the boys, and we're going to get to the bottom of this. Susan's like, Albert, don't go get the boys involved with this. Just leave it be. The lady doesn't need to be disturbed, nor does her husband. He's like, Susan, if there's a Frankenstein living next door, then that concerns not only me and you and the safety of our child, that concerns the safety of all the children living in this town and all of our neighbors. So I think it is good to go down to the clubhouse with the boys and wrangle them up and go deal with the Frankenstein. I think that's the best course of action. Susan's like, you know what? I don't want to have this argument with you. If you want to go get the boys and rile them up and go take out a Frankenstein, be my guest. That's you, Albert. And Albert was like, okay, well, fine. Maybe I will. Maybe I am going to go get the boys, and we're going to wrangle them up and go and catch ourselves a Frankenstein. And so Albert got in his car and went down to the clubhouse down the street where all the boys hang out. He entered, and there was this loud, blaring blues music, and there was a bunch of cigar smoke in the air, and there was sports games on the TV, and everybody was playing pool, billiards, and they were, drinking, having a great time. And Albert came in there, and he pulled the plug on the jukebox that was blaring the blues music, and the place went dead silent, and everybody turned to him, and they're like, Albert, what are you doing? Albert, you okay? And he was like, guys, boys, a Frankenstein has come to our town of Ruffington and is posing a threat to the safety of all of our children, all that we hold dear. And I am coming to you to ask you if you will take up arms with me against this Frankenstein. And the boys were, they were quiet for a second. They're like, Albert, are you pulling our leg? Or are you being serious that there's a Frankenstein in this town? In our hollowed town of Ruffington, Nebraska, there has come a Frankenstein. And Albert was like, do you think I would come to you and lie about there being a Frankenstein in my hometown? So the boys, they sat there looking at their drinks for a minute, and they were like, well, Albert has come in here many a days and told us some wild things, many a times. And you've said many a tall tales, but each one of them has been true, and you've never lied to us. This one may seem a little outrageous, but you've said some pretty you've said some pretty outrageous stuff before, and it's all been true. So me personally, he stood up and he looked at the rest of them. This boy did, and he said, me personally, I think I believe Albert. I believe Albert, and I'm gonna go with Albert and see this Frankenstein and figure out what's going on here. And the rest of the boys, they stood up. They said, Albert, where you go, we go with you. And they all grabbed their pitchforks and torches and said, now you just show us where this Frankenstein's living. And they all head down the street and walked one by one, marching in a big mob towards the house. And as the neighbors saw them coming down the street, they would all get their pitchforks and torches and join up with the mob. And the mob explained, there's a Frankenstein. And the mob was huge. It was hundreds of people, and they all advanced towards the house. And they all arrived outside the house. And Albert's like, all right, this is it. No going back. We're gonna go inside this house. We're gonna get that Frankenstein, and we're gonna kill him. We're gonna drag him out in the street and kill him. So if anybody doesn't want to be a part of that, then I would say go home now. Because once we enter there, there's no turning back. You are part of a mob that is going to be killing a Frankenstein, and we're going to be dragging him out in the street and killing him. And, the mob there were a couple that were like, maybe we shouldn't do this. Maybe we should, call the police or something and get this investigated out before we go and enact mob justice on a supposed Frankenstein. But they quickly changed their minds, and they all, as one mob, marched forward into the house. And as they entered the house, their torchlight revealed a dark and eerie interior. They cautiously advanced through the decaying rooms, their anxiety growing with each step. Finally, they reached a hidden chamber down in the basement. Their torchlight flickered, revealing a hulking figure crouched in the corner. Albert hesitated, and he looked back at the rest of the mob. He's like, that's him. That's the Frankenstein. They were all worried. They were all holding their breath and, gasping and all nervous. But as the light steadied, the truth became clear. The so-called Frankenstein was not a Frankenstein at all. It was a frightened and disheveled man, covered in rags and filth. The young lady called out. She said, please don't hurt him. The mob, they moved their torches and illuminated it. It was the young lady, and she was with the monster, and she seemed to be caring for his, wounds. He had cracked hands. It seemed he had been working and toiling away in this lair that he was in. And, they realized now that, the creature, this Frankenstein, was not really a Frankenstein. He was just a man with the mind of a child that this woman was taking care of, and it wasn't really her husband either. I think this might have been her father or some other family member that she had unfortunately had to take care of, and they had some sort of condition that made them look like a monster, but really they weren't. They were just a normal person, just not completely normal, but they had something wrong with them, but they weren't the evil Frankenstein that they had thought. And the mob, they looked around, and Albert looked at them and he said, guys, we can't drag this guy out on the street and beat him to death. That wouldn't be right. They were like, you know what, you're right, Albert. We should not drag this man outside and bludgeon him to death. That would not be correct. And so the whole town came together. The whole town came together and took pity on the poor soul, and they ended up hugging him and comforting him and saying, it'll be all right. And Albert turned to the woman. He said, you could have told me this. I was under the impression that your husband was, a Frankenstein or something. And she was like, oh, I could understand how you would think that. No, he just has Down syndrome.